Good morning, MacLaren. In HL10, we just finished talking about the American Civil War and Reconstruction. The war succeeded in ending slavery for 4 million Americans, but efforts to establish freedmen on equal economic footing were mixed and largely unsuccessful after the war. As the period of formal Reconstruction ended, many Americans were looking west for new opportunities, including freedmen who found the South slow to change. The Pikes Peak Gold Rush took place during the Civil War, leading to the establishment of Denver and Colorado Springs by 1870, and many, both black and white, would come west seeking fortune and new opportunities in the following year. One such individual was Henry Adams, a former slave in Louisiana who became a land promoter and arranged what became known as the Great Exodus of 1879. With his encouragement, at least 20,000 African Americans moved west to homestead on the Great Plains, especially to Kansas and Oklahoma. Here's a recruitment poster from that time, along with a picture of another promoter, Benjamin Pat Singleton. Many of those recruited came from Louisiana and Arkansas. In Tennessee, fringes of the Deep South, they would travel to St. Louis and from there cross the river into Kansas on migration trains. The people who made this migration became known as Exodusters, combining the theme of an exodus with the dry, dusty, unirrigated land they frequently had to settle on as latecomers in the homestead rush. Looking at this map, you can see some of the major black settlements of Oklahoma and Kansas. And some settlements even spilled into the eastern parts of Colorado. Many of these towns did not last long. If land was available to the Exodusters, it was almost always upland, that is to say, without water for irrigation, and had to be dry farmed, a challenging enough proposition, even under the best circumstances. It was a completely new type of farming for those who moved, and the land was changing in ways that made it even harder. Eventually, many of those settlements and their neighboring European settlements would find themselves part of the Dust Bowl, land that, once converted to agricultural, lost much of its ability to retain moisture and eventually blew away during droughts in the 1930s. Some settlements, though, such as Nicodemus, still remain. Despite the challenges of farming, many of the Exodusters played an important role in settling the West. Many worked on railroads that were so critical to American settlement, and an estimated 20% of cowboys in some states were African Americans. Many also found work in the US Army, manning frontier posts and serving in the Indian Wars that continued in the American West through the 1890s. And while the world they helped create may have not been exactly what they had in mind when they left, it was far better than what they left behind. These twins are Elise and Leila Scott, daughters of Exodusters John and Julia Scott, who first migrated from Louisiana to Indiana and then to Stafford County, Kansas. Migration has long been one of the best ways to improve one's condition, and this was just as true for those already within the United States as it was for those who were immigrating to the United States. There is a more local connection that interests me in this topic. About 25 miles south of Greeley in northern Colorado sits the abandoned ruins of a town that represents a second part of the Great Exodus from the South. These are the ruins of Deerfield, a small and briefly successful colony of African Americans settled in 1910 on the Colorado Plains. The town was founded by Oliver Toussaint Jackson, a fascinating figure in Colorado history who someday will get his own assembly. The name Deer, D-E-A-R, signified how precious the land and independence were to the settlers to come. Eventually, some 700 residents with nearly 20,000 acres under cultivation. The 1920s saw a great success for the colony in wheat, melon, and other crops. Many residents worked in Denver and farmed on the weekends, but they were still able to do better than the subsistence sharecropping of the South. Some full-time farmers grew crops for Crooner's Cannery in Denver, a brand you can still find in the canned food aisle today. And while the end of World War I reduced demand for Deerfield's agricultural products, the town remained, for a time, fairly prosperous. Like many other Exoduster communities, it was dust that would end Deerfield. The soil was not suitable for sustained agriculture, and the community lacked access to irrigation that would make their land more profitable. Like many communities on Colorado's Great Plains, the Great Depression was the final step in the long and slow decline of prairie agriculture. People gradually left Deerfield, taking jobs in Greeley or Denver or anywhere they could get work, occasionally returning to Deerfield, and increasingly finding that there was nothing to return to. By 1940, the town's population was 12 people. When founder Jackson died in 1948, he was one of the town's last residents, although it was not fully abandoned until the 1970s. World War II had again brought change to the region, and while those who moved indeed did find better lives, they did not necessarily find them in Nicodemus or Deerfield.